In 1516, the Ottoman privateer brothers Arouj and Hayreddin Barbarossa, who operated successfully under the Hafsids, moved their base of operations to Algiers. They succeeded in conquering Gijel and Algiers from the Spaniards with help from the locals who saw them as liberators from the Christians, but the brothers eventually assassinated the local noble Salim al-Tumi and took control over the city and the surrounding regions. When Arouj was killed in 1518 during his invasion of Tlemcen, Hayreddin succeeded him as military commander of Algiers. The Ottoman Sultan gave him the title of Beylerbey and a contingent of some 2,000 janissaries. With the aid of this force and native Algerians, Hayreddin conquered the whole area between Constantine and Oran, although the city of Oran remained in Spanish hands until 1792. Hayreddin Barbarossa. The next Beylerbey was Hayreddin's son Hassan, who assumed the position in 1544. He was a Khalafli or of mixed origins, as his mother was an Algerian Mooress. Until 1587, Beylik of Algiers was governed by Beylerbeys who served terms with no fixed limits. Subsequently, with the institution of a regular administration, governors with the title of Pasha ruled for 3-year terms. The Pasha was assisted by an autonomous janissary unit, known in Algeria as the Oyak, who were led by an Aga. Discontent among the Oyak rose in the mid-1600s because they were not paid regularly, and they repeatedly revolted against the Pasha. As a result, the Aga charged the Pasha with corruption and incompetence and seized power in 1659. Plague had repeatedly struck the cities of North Africa. Algiers lost between 30,000 and 50,000 inhabitants to the plague in 1620-21, and had high fatalities in 1654-57, 1665, 1691 and 1740-42. Christian slaves in Algiers. 1706. The Barbary pirates preyed on Christian and other non-Islamic shipping in the western Mediterranean Sea. The pirates often took the passengers and crew on the ships and sold them or used them as slaves. They also did a brisk business in ransoming some of the captives. According to Robert Davis, from the 16th to 19th century, pirates captured 1 million to 1.25 million Europeans as slaves. They often made raids on European coastal towns to capture Christian slaves to sell at slave markets in North Africa and other parts of the Ottoman Empire. In 1544, for example, Hayreddin Barbarossa captured the island of Ischia, taking 4,000 prisoners, and enslaved some 9,000 inhabitants of Lipari, almost the entire population. In 1551, the Ottoman governor of Algiers, Turgut Reis, enslaved the entire population of the Maltese island of Gozo. Barbary pirates often attacked the Balearic Islands. The threat was so severe that residents abandoned the island of Formentera. The introduction of broad-sail ships from the beginning of the 17th century allowed them to branch out into the Atlantic. In July 1627, 2 pirate ships from Algiers under the command of Dutch pirate Jan Janszoon sailed as far as Iceland, raiding and capturing slaves. 2 weeks earlier, another pirate ship from Salé in Morocco had also raided in Iceland. Some of the slaves brought to Algiers were later ransomed back to Iceland, but some chose to stay in Algeria. In 1629, pirate ships from Algeria raided the Faroe Islands. In 1671, the Taifa of Races, or the company of corsair captains, rebelled, killed the Aga, and placed one of its own in power. The new leader received the title of Dey. After 1689, the right to select the Dey passed to the Divan, a council of some 60 nobles. It was at first dominated by the Oyak, but by the 18th century, it had become the Dey's instrument. In 1710, the Dey persuaded the Sultan to recognize him and his successors as regent, replacing the Pasha in that role. Although Algiers remained nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, in reality they acted independently from the rest of the empire, and often had wars with other Ottoman subjects and territories such as the Beylik of Tunis. The Dey was in effect a constitutional autocrat. The Dey was elected for a life term, but in the 159 years 1671-1830 that the system was in place, 14 of the 29 Deys were assassinated. Despite usurpation, military coups and occasional mob rule, the day-to-day operation of the Deylikal government was remarkably orderly. Although the regency patronized the tribal chieftains, it never had the unanimous allegiance of the countryside, where heavy taxation frequently provoked unrest. Autonomous tribal states were tolerated, and the regency's authority was seldom applied in the Kabylia, although in 1730 the regency was able to take control over the kingdom of Kuku in western Kabylia. Many cities in the northern parts of the Algerian desert paid taxes to Algiers or one of its beys, although they otherwise retained complete autonomy from central control, while the deeper parts of the Sahara were completely independent from Algiers. Barbary raids in the Mediterranean continued to attack Spanish merchant shipping, and as a result, the Spanish Navy bombarded Algiers in 1783 and 1784. For the attack in 1784, the Spanish fleet was to be joined by ships from such traditional enemies of Algiers as Naples, Portugal and the Knights of Malta. Over 20,000 cannonballs were fired, much of the city and its fortifications were destroyed and most of the Algerian fleet was sunk. In 1792, Algiers took back Oran and Mers el-Kebir, the two last Spanish strongholds in Algeria. In the same year, they conquered the Moroccan Reef and Dushtah, which they then abandoned in 1795. Bombardment of Algiers by the Anglo-Dutch fleet, to support the ultimatum to release European slaves, August 1816. In the 19th century, Algerian pirates forged affiliations with Caribbean powers, paying a license tax in exchange for safe harbor of their vessels. Attacks by Algerian pirates on American merchantmen resulted in the First and Second Barbary Wars, which ended the attacks on U.S. ships in 1815. A year later, a combined Anglo-Dutch fleet, under the command of Lord Exmouth, bombarded Algiers to stop similar attacks on European fishermen. These efforts proved successful, although Algerian piracy would continue until the French conquest in 1830. French colonization 1830-1962. Under the pretext of a slight to their consul, the French invaded and captured Algiers in 1830. Historian Ben Kiernan wrote on the French conquest of Algeria. By 1875, the French conquest was complete. The war had killed approximately 825,000 indigenous Algerians since 1830. French losses from 1831 to 1851 were 92,329 dead in the hospital and only 3,336 killed in action. The population of Algeria, which stood at about 2.9 million in 1872, reached nearly 11 million in 1960. French policy was predicated on civilizing the country. The slave trade and piracy in Algeria ceased following the French conquest. The conquest of Algeria by the French took some time and resulted in considerable bloodshed. A combination of violence and disease epidemics caused the indigenous Algerian population to decline by nearly one-third from 1830 to 1872. On September 17, 1860, Napoleon III declared, "Our first duty is to take care of the happiness of the 3 million Arabs, whom the fate of arms has brought under our domination." During this time, only Kabylia resisted. The Kabylians were not colonized until after the Makrani revolt in 1871. Emir Abdelkader, Algerian leader insurgent against French colonial rule, 1865. From 1848 until independence, France administered the whole Mediterranean region of Algeria as an integral part and department of the nation. One of France's longest-held overseas territories, Algeria became a destination for hundreds of thousands of European immigrants, who became known as colons and later, as Pied Noirs. Between 1825 and 1847, 50,000 French people emigrated to Algeria. These settlers benefited from the French government's confiscation of communal land from tribal peoples, and the application of modern agricultural techniques that increased the amount of arable land. Many Europeans settled in Oran and Algiers, and by the early 20th century they formed a majority of the population in both cities. The 6 historical leaders of the FLN, Rababatat, Mostafa Ben Boulaid, Didouche Mourad, Mohamed Boudif, Krim Belkacem and Lerbi Ben Mhaidi. During the late 19th and early 20th century, the European share was almost a fifth of the population. The French government aimed at making Algeria an assimilated part of France, and this included substantial educational investments, especially after 1900. The indigenous cultural and religious resistance heavily opposed this tendency, but in contrast to the other colonized countries' path in Central Asia and Caucasus, Algeria kept its individual skills and a relatively human capital-intensive agriculture. During the Second World War, Algeria came under Vichy control before being liberated by the Allies in Operation Torch, which saw the first large-scale deployment of American troops in the North African Campaign. Deployment of American